Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third Thursday Lunchtime Lecture Series for August of 2023, where I'm delighted to introduce Rick Kelley, who's been a forester in the area for 40 years, which is a long time to be hanging out in the woods.
A lot of ticks.
Don't bring up ticks, please. And he's going to talk to us today about the history of forestry in Vermont and some of the current use practices, right?
Great.
So that's my introduction. Welcome, Rick Kelley.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here with the Dorset Historical Society today. Thank you very much for coming. What we're going to be looking at is a series of slides that come from the Harvard Forest dioramas. Now, Harvard Forest is located in Petersham, Massachusetts. It's 5,000 acres of land and has a museum there. And all these dioramas that you're going to be looking at are made from copper wire in the 1930s by a guy named William Fisher. And he's done a spectacular job of going through the changes in land use in New England, in primarily Vermont. So we're going to start out with all that. And this is just a simple picture. You'll see a lot of these same people all through here. You have to look kind of closely. Different guys are doing different things. This guy's tending some trees over here. This is a small cutting. This is called a group selection cutting. We're going to get into that in a bit. But first what we're going to do is just go through how the land use history has changed in Vermont and what's going on and up to current days. And then we're going to talk about a little of the silvicultural practices that are used and how that conservation has changed since the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, the 21st century. So we'll get into all of that. As I said, these are Harvard Forest dioramas. I want to give full credit to Richard Fisher. He did these in the 30s. And at the end of the slideshow, I'll show you how he put these together. There's one slide that just kind of puts them all together. But it's just incredible work. It's very fun. So this is the primeval forest, what it looked like in Vermont pre-1700. And as you can see, it's primarily an old age forest, large, very, very large trees. The far left is hemlock, white pine, beech, sugar maple. But over on the left side, you'll see some smaller trees, gray birch, red cedar, and a few others. And the key thing here to remember is that the only thing that really changed the landscape prior to the New England settlers, or the colonial period, are hurricanes, windstorms, soils, different soils. For example, up on mountaintops, pretty shallow soils, things would blow down or not be established. Ice storms, pathogens, a lot of insect issues, and fires, natural fires, typically started by lightning. Now, yes, some of the Native Americans did burn areas for wildlife and hunting or whatever, but it was primarily those 4 or 5 things that changed the face of the forest in New England. The first settlers, and I want you to pay attention to this house. The first settlers came around 1740, and Vermont was transformed at this period of time. So this is 220 years ago, somewhere in there, 320 years ago, excuse me. And the European settlers drastically changed everything. So imagine going into that forest, the previous picture, and cutting down those trees by hand, taking all the stumps out, taking all the rocks out, and trying to make a field. It's just phenomenal work that they did. Typically, just a man, maybe his wife, and some family members would be doing this. And it's breathtaking what they were able to accomplish in a relatively short period of time. And the walls that they built. And the walls that they built are still evidence that we see throughout the forest, everywhere. So the key thing here is that the colonial period really started the forest undertaking, the transformation. The height of the clearing, here's our house again, and now he's got a barn. And a road. It's got to take it to market. So it peaked around, the height of forest clearing agriculture peaked in 1830. It was really 1880. It peaked a lot later than that. And at that time, in 1899, Burlington, Vermont was the largest exporter of sheep in the world. I mean, the port of Burlington. So they had to either go down the Lake Champlain, the Hudson River, or up the Missisquoi to St. Lawrence River and out. But they shipped sheep everywhere. And then, of course, Australia took over within a year because we shipped sheep to Australia and they grew them there, and that was the end of that. But it's fascinating that the land was so open that we have so many sheep. So typically, in this time period, about 80 to 85% of Vermont was open land, as was New Hampshire. And now it's 85% forested. Even with all the shopping malls, the highways, the roads, everything else, it's 85% forested. And you can look out of the, Mother America or wherever you want around here, and you'll see all the trees. Those are essentially bald. And when you go up into the woods, you keep passing wall after wall after wall. And it's amazing that all these clearings were done all the way up the mountains. So it's a significant change because of this. So now it was really open, and now it's closed back again. So then, about just after the Civil War, farm abandonment started. And why did it start? Because a lot of the men went off to the Civil War and fought and were killed. And some people went west. Horace Greeley, go west, young man, and they found the farmland in Illinois was 10 feet deep. So they go out in these deep, rich soils, no rocks. They could grow anything they wanted, huge yields. Yields tripled. And they started up with hybrid corn and different hybrid crops and had a huge yield. As a result, a lot of the hillside farms started closing down. And you can see these houses are being abandoned. And what's happened is that those fields would have scarified soils because they had crops in them. And all of a sudden, nothing is being planted, and the seed from the surrounding land forest that's left flies in there, primarily white pine, because white pine is a very light seed, blows around easily. So white pine comes in and will dominate the next stage of forests or next stage of land in Vermont. Also, at the same time, a lot of the hardwoods start coming in. And the reason they come in is that the birches primarily are very light seeded as well. And they'll blow in, but they don't grow as prolifically as white pine in the early stages. So the white pine would overtop them, the hardwoods would be in the understory, and the softwoods would be in the overstory. And there's no management going on, so it's the softwoods that are taking off in size and are quite large. And you can see I like this guy's out hunting already. David likes that he's out. But and this is a big deal. I'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the same farm that we saw earlier, but now it's got a crop of white pine trees on it. So this is maybe 1910 to 1930. Those trees are not very old. They're only about 60, 70 years old. So they're only about, maybe 14 inches in diameter. There's white pine, and white pine is easy to cut. So remember with those hardwoods, if you're trying to cut a big oak tree with an axe and a handsaw, it takes a long time. White pine is 3 times easier to fell. And white pine makes very good lumber. So the key here is that at this time, there's a big demand for lumber. More settlers are coming in, cutting down the white pine trees, making lumber. And the big one is boxboard. Now, you've probably never heard of boxboard, maybe you have, but they didn't invent cardboard until around 1932. So everything was shipped in boxes. And those boxes were made out of white pine. And it had a huge demand for those boxes. So that's why they had the demand for these white pines. And in cutting these down, I love the picture of these guys in the foreground cutting, and you can see the oxen teams dragging logs over here. You can see the hardwoods that are still left there in the understory. They're kind of scattered through here. And that's going to make the big difference in the future of the next stand, of the forest stand. So now, old field white pine is now succeeded by hardwoods. And this is more 1940s in there. This is my favorite shot. All that's left of the farm is a chimney. But we've gone through this whole succession. All the fields now are growing back in. All that land in the background was all opened at one time, and now it's closed up again. And the deer, this is ideal deer habitat, because the deer are only, a real deer is only about 4 feet high. You think of these giant animals, well, they're big, but they're only about 4 feet high. And they can only reach about 6 feet off the ground, even on their hind legs. So if you go through the forest in certain areas where there's quality deer habitat, you'll see a browse line it's just like with cows or any other animal, right at a certain height. They can't get any higher unless they're on snow. But even if they're on snow, deer hoofs are very small and they sink. And that's a real problem for deer. That's why they go into what's called deer yards in the winter. And deer yards have very heavy hemlock overstory typically and very light snow cover on the ground. And that way they can escape from predators if necessary. But because of deep snow, they're going to get caught by, in this case, wolves or even bobcats. So the deer are coming back here. They love the browse. And how much browse do a deer eat? A deer eats a tremendous amount of food. They typically would eat 8 to 10 pounds of buds, just buds, a day. So what they do is, there's no teeth on the top of a deer's jaw. They're only on the bottom. There's just a hard plate up here. And they bite and they rip up. So you can always see if a deer has been eating something because you'll see a little mark on the bottom where he's ripped the buds off. And there's about 370 buds per pound. And so we got to get 10 pounds of that so we can do the math. So you're looking at 3,000 buds. So it's 3,000 times 1 per day. So all those trees that could come up as a result of those buds are not going to be around. So deer, and it's a real problem now in Vermont in terms of regeneration, deer can really strip a forest pretty quickly until the trees are up about 6 feet. Then deer can't touch them and away they go. So you'll see a real problem. And a lot of times you'll see trees that they're coming up and they have squiggly patterns going off the sides, and that's because they've been heavily browsed. Each year that stem gets bitten off, the lateral shoots will get bitten off, and new ones will form. So it looks all zigzaggy. So that is a very standard sign of what's going on. So anyway, this area now is, old field has come in, we're getting hardwood regeneration, and all the hardwoods are going to start coming up. So then we get the vigorous growth of hardwood. Primarily, there's a number of different things. Ash, birch, red oak, maple. Red oak was not quite so dominant at this time as it is now. And that's because the climate's warming. And as it warms, red oak starts moving its range further north. So only in the last 10 years have we seen more and more red oak sliding its way north. And as a result, sugar maple is also sliding its way north because its habitat, it likes a little bit colder weather, and so it's kind of sliding up toward Canada. There's still a lot of sugar maple. We're going to have a lot of maple syrup. We don't have to worry about it, but it's a real issue. So as a result of this is that we have the hardwood forest that's come in, and the question becomes one of how is that managed? Well, until recently, not a lot was done. We're going to talk about how the silvicultural practices have changed this. But initially, all these sprouts would come in, and there are certain species that are very prolific sprouters. Black cherry, oak, soft maple, the birches. And by sprouting, I mean if their stump is cut, they'll send up shoots around the stump. They're called stump sprouts or stool shoots. And the nice thing about those is that they grow very rapidly because there's already a fully established root system. So you have a giant tree, fully established root system, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of sprouts coming up. And they would go in, and this is commonly done in Europe, more so than the United States. They commonly come in and take all the sprouts out except for maybe one or the two best ones. And they have a root system already established, and they would grow very rapidly because of that root system. But it's not really done that much anymore. In this case, these are oak trees that they made here. Remember, these are copper wires. But you can tell they're oaks because of their branching pattern. So remember, sugar maple and ash, for example, both have opposite branching. So if you have a straight stem going up like this, and you see two things coming off like that, it's either a maple, ash, or a dogwood. Those are the only trees that do that. So all the other ones are alternate branching. One goes here, and then the next one comes up, goes that way, the next one comes up. So it's quite different. But you can usually tell on a lot of diagrams, different things, what the species are. So this forest is changing quickly. The red oak is overtopping. Some of the shorter-lived trees, like the birches, are going to start dying off. The birches typically 50 to 60, 70 years. whereas the other ones will go 150 or more. So now this is a photograph. This is not a diorama. This is just a picture of what the New England forest looks like. And it's interesting because you can see the stone wall, you can see this is a yellow birch in the foreground, sugar maple, and this tree is probably 18 inches diameter, it's probably about 12. And you get a real mix here. This is called an uneven age forest, when there's different age groups throughout the forest. And we're going to talk about the difference in management techniques for even aged versus uneven aged. So an uneven age forest is something like that, whereas an even age forest, all the trees are the same height, the same diameter, and they're all growing together, and they're managed quite differently. The other thing I want to emphasize today is conservation. One of the key things that we've seen throughout the United States, and this is an old growth diorama from the Harvard Forest. You can see these giant pine trees here and some maple back here, a couple of dead trees for, could be insects or old age or whatever. But it's conservation, and the key thing is that forests really are the precursor of good conservation everywhere. Certainly what's happened in California after the fires, the mudslides down the mountain, there's no stability in the soils, and it's a significant problem. And the same thing, these are old growth forests, and we can find that these are very stable ecosystems typically. And they're typically very diverse ecosystem. And remember that the best ecosystem is the most diverse. If you only have one species in there, you're susceptible to damage by whatever. The classic case is the West Coast or the Rocky Mountains with the pine bark beetles, and they killed everything. I mean, I don't know if you spent much time out there, but they probably killed 40% of the trees in the Rocky Mountains from New Mexico all the way up through Canada. And that's what's dying or it fires. So I could smell some smoke this morning. Do you guys smell that at all? But obviously we've had a lot of smoke here from Quebec and from British Columbia. But it's the pine bark beetles that are killing everything, and those trees are just laying in the forest floor, and up they go. Whereas here, with a diverse ecosystem, it's more stable. You have larger trees, you have more hardwoods. Hardwoods are less susceptible to fire, and it makes a significant difference. We're going to talk about fire in a second here. Wildlife habitat, dynamic landscape again. The more diverse habitat you have, the better. What most species like are what's called edge effect. So if you have a forest, instead of having a real stiff, a field like this and then a wall of really high trees, that's called a hard edge. You want a soft edge where it blends in different plants and species as you work your way up into a taller forest. A hard edge technically differentiates too much, and there's not enough food available for different species of animals. The other nice thing about this, we're going to talk about wildlife for a second with ruffed grouse. The key to ruffed grouse management in Vermont, and actually throughout the country, the lake states as well, is aspen trees, or popple. Aspen is a preferred food of grouse by far. And typically, if you have any aspen on your property and you pay attention, the male catkins on the big aspen trees is the #1 food species. But grouse, for survival, want a 3-level forest, a 3-stage forest. In a 3-stage forest, typically the lower area with, say, very dense aspen trees, maybe only 3 or 4 feet high, is excellent for brood cover. They need that brood cover to protect their chicks when they're young, and it provides food for them, all the insects, everything else that go scurrying around in the understory. And that's terrific. The next layer up is intermediate aspen trees that may be 10 to 15 feet high or more, and those are typically great for escape cover for the bigger birds, because they'll be preyed upon by hawks or whatever, and they go zooming. I don't know if you've ever seen grouse go through the woods quickly, but they're incredibly fast in weaving through trees. And they can zoom through those trees very well and escape predators. And the 3rd stage, of course, is a large aspen, the really big stuff, and that's what they really like for food. And they climb to the top of those trees or fly to the top of those trees and eat that. Aspen, the easiest way to regenerate aspen is clearings. Aspen is a very prolific root-suckering species. So we could go cut, if we had an acre of land here with 10 aspen trees, we could clear cut everything and it would come back to aspen. I mean, because the root system of the aspen trees would all send up new suckers. We've done this time and time again. I have some people that I work with that are big rough grouse hunters, and we do this on their property. And there's a huge flush of aspen, and therefore a huge flush of rough grouse as well. So the partridge habitat is really key, and it's part of the ecosystem management. We're going to talk about ecosystem management a little bit more. The last part of this is erosion. And the key thing here, again, is the forests really help prevent erosion. In fact, the Vermont State Legislature 2 years ago passed some new rules about timber harvesting because they were worried about timber harvesting in southern Vermont affecting Lake Champlain because of potential runoff. Well, that was a little far-fetched maybe, but that was a concern. And the key here is that by maintaining the hillsides with forests, especially the steeper slopes, you're going to protect the watersheds. Finally, talk about fire. Again, this is a diorama. They made fire trucks and everything. It's interesting that we don't talk much about fire in Vermont and New England because people call it asbestos forest. Well, in many ways it is. Things don't burn very well here. It's always too wet. Or the species are not susceptible to burning like the pine is out west. So as a result, we have very small fires typically, at only maybe 10, 20 acres at the most. And also because we have road access. So there's roads all through here, all through Vermont, just about everywhere. There's places up in the National Forest that are a little more diverse and spread out, but not many. And because there's access, we're able to control fires. Now the Forest Service made a big push, as did the US government, to control fires throughout the country. Here it's easy, out west it was more difficult, but they did. I worked in Idaho for a while, and I've seen fires come down the mountainside, jump 4 lanes of highway, go up the other side in a minute. They move so rapidly in heavy winds, it's frightening. Fighting fires is maybe the worst job ever I've done. Because the smoke, it's just the smoke inhalation is just terrible. But so forest fires is a real problem. It was a real problem, but really not so much in New England. And so this is what the habitat might look like after a fire. So foresters got together, hey, so what happened in this fire is a lot of the understory was burned off. The soil had this ash component to it. It seemed to improve the soil quite a bit. And as a result, there was a big flush of new growth, regeneration. So now the Forest Service does a lot of controlled burn. Now, and even private landowners have done this. By controlled burn, typically what you do is you lay out an area maybe 20 acres. And it's an area that's been cut over, typically. And you have what's called a drip torch. And it's just a can with a torch on the end, and you just walk around the edge of the forest and drop the fire down, and the fire catches, and you do it in such a way as it goes toward each other and burns the whole area, and then it goes out on its own. Now, does it always work? Well, a few have gotten away, no question. But it usually does work very well. There's a crew there too to protect it and the whole thing, so that part is great. But it does work very well, and it works really well for regeneration. So by doing that, you can eliminate a lot of species that you might not want, say raspberries or other bushes or invasive plants or beech. Beech becomes a real problem. And you can eliminate those things with the fire, and new growth will come back in. And it's typically light-seeded species. If you want to grow birches, yellow birch I think is one of the best trees. The wood is terrific. Or even maple, it works very well for reestablishment of those trees. So let's talk about forest management in central New England a little bit. I always think of this guy as being Ogden Pleisner. You're looking at his birch tree. He's the famous painter that always paints birch trees. But in New England, there's a number of things that have happened. So if we go back to the 1700s, when the Crown, the King of England, owned all the forests, we've all been by J.K. Adams, right? We know J.K. Adams really well. The broadaxe symbol, right? The arrow that he has, that was put on any tree white pine tree, 24 inches or greater, within 10 miles of a river, a navigable river. And those were considered crown trees, meaning that the crown, King of England, owned those trees, and they were reserved for the English Navy, for mass. And that was very common. So even, I don't know if Malcolm Cooper owns J.K. House. I don't know if he's got a sample. There used to be some samples around of the original stuff. So did that always work for the settlers that were in New England and whatever? Well, you know, if you're a settler, you're a farmer, and you're working your way through something, and all of a sudden you come across a big pine tree with a broad axe, and you go, wait a minute, that's the King of England's tree, I can't touch that. Or you cut it down, you scrape the mark off, and you haul it to the mill, or whatever it is. And it was pretty common that a lot of the settlers cut many of the king's trees. And sometimes we would mark other trees. And this happened, and then in English Parliament passed another law, I think in the 1780s or 90s, that they changed the diameter size down to like 12 inches, thinking that they'd get all these trees. Well, that didn't go over very well either. But nevertheless, there was more than enough white pine throughout New England to satisfy the Navy. And they could never have harvested all of them anyway. So it was just kind of a, you know, say, this is my stuff, don't mess with it. But the settlers did. So and they took what they needed. So the forest management now in central New England is really based on the new forestry, what we call the new forestry or ecosystem management. So up until about 1960s, with all the great books that were written, Rachel Carson and others, the thinking changed toward a holistic approach toward all our ecosystems, and certainly in forestry. And this ecosystem approach meant a different look at how forests are managed. We have to take into account water, wildlife, aesthetics, recreation, whatever it might be. And in fact, the Forest Service used to be made up just of foresters. Now it's poets, it's ecologists, it's water resource people, it's everything. And that's a good thing, because they're taking into account a diverse approach, just like they want a diverse approach for trees. So if we look at these early treatments in hardwood stands, this is more of a silvicultural approach. What does silviculture mean? Silviculture is a German term for the management of wood, or management of forest. Silva, forest. It's management of forest. And silviculture has changed significantly. The first silviculture in the United States was practiced at the Biltmore Forest in Asheville, North Carolina. This is Frederick Vanderbilt's son's place. And in 1896, Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed much of Biltmore, also did Central Park, as you know, and designed the gardens at Biltmore. If you've ever been there, it's worth going just to see the gardens. And brought in a guy named Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was the father of forestry in the United States. He was the first forester and came in to develop their work with the Vanderbilt Forest. And as a result, the Biltmore Forest expanded, was about 100,000 acres. Pinchot left in around 1905, 1910 to go work for the federal government. Teddy Roosevelt, 1902, maybe 3. Teddy Roosevelt brought him in and wanted him to take over the Forest Service. He just started the Forest Service and wanted Pinchot to run it, and he did. And so then Vanderbilt brought in a guy named Schenck from Germany. So all the forestry in the United States really emanates from central Germany and the Black Forest and all these, Stuttgart and all these other places. And Schenck is the guy that started the Biltmore Forestry School. And the first 300 graduates of the Biltmore Forestry School over the next 10 years went on to become foresters all over the United States. And this stick that I've been playing with is actually what's called a Biltmore stick. It is designed by Biltmore, and what it does, you get a number of different things for this. On one side it's a tree scale stick. So I can take this and I can hold it up to a tree this way, and I know what the diameter of the tree is without putting a tape measure around the whole tree and then dividing it by pi and the whole thing. So pi r squared. So, and that's because I'm reading tangents of each side of the tree off the stick. So one side of the tree is here, one side of the tree is here, and right away that tree is then 24 inches in diameter. So it's a really quick tool. Similarly, you can measure logs with this. It has a log scale stick on it. On this scale is regular inches. So if you have I have my glasses on, say a 14-inch log, and you have 3 8-foot sections, that's going to have 185 board feet. So it's very quick, easy to do, and everyone uses these, or used to, not so much anymore because it's all electronic. And on the third side is called a merit hypsometer. And on this side, you can measure the height of the tree. So heights of trees are measured quite easily by, remember forestry is all math. The height of a tree is, if you know 2 sides and an angle, you can figure out the rest of a right triangle. But in this case, we're taking 2 angles to the side. So if you have a tree like this and the ground is this way, you know this is a 45-degree angle. You go out 100 feet, you measure this angle, let's say it's 40, so you know the height of the tree is 40 feet. Pretty simple, pretty easy. Well, then I have to add my height from the ground to my eye, because my eye is looking here. And so it's 46 feet, or whatever. So it's pretty simple, but that's how it's done. It's kind of fun to see some of the old tools and how it's really worked out. So the early treatment of these stands then is that they used to think that weeding and all these things were really important, and they are. So they come in and they, you know, in Germany, they almost start with scissors. You know, cutting off, it's like a garden. You go into your garden and you cut off the flowers you don't want, or you deadhead the things, or whatever you're doing. And forestry is the same thing, because you're growing plants. It's just biology. And if it's nice if you can go in and snip, snip, snip. So who's going to pay for that? That's not going to happen unless it's on your own land. And then they thought, well, okay, we'll let that go, and then we'll do an intermediate thinning instead. And the trees will be maybe 6 inches in diameter. And if you're lugging a big chainsaw around or an axe, that gets really tedious. Now the electric chainsaws, real quickly, those are really great. But it's still a real problem because it's such a bulky and time-consuming thing. It's too expensive. So forest management has changed because it has to take into account economics. And the economics become a huge development in terms of how things are managed. We're going to see how it really changes in the 21st century. So what they're doing here is they're just going in, they're tending the gardens. There's a forester here trimming, there's another one in there trimming. And then on the other side you have an old white pine, or old field white pine. You see the stone wall, so you know it's old field white pine. And they're going to go in there and do the same thing. So an improvement cutting in a hardwood stand is the next step. This is another activity. And here they're doing that intermediate cutting that we're talking about. They're actually going in, and here, because I wish the slides were a little bit clearer, we need it bigger. You can see that pile of wood, that's cordwood or firewood. There's probably just cordwood. You can sell cordwood, hardwood. And that, so it takes out the poor quality stuff. And what you want to do is get rid of the junk wood. It's typically called UGS, undesirable growing stock, or cull. And so if you get rid of UGS and cull, you're going to grow a better stand because you want to favor the high quality, high value trees and open them up. You want to give them more crown area, and you want to give more space on the ground. Spread them out. And it pays off because the yield is so much better. For example, if you come into this area and you don't do that, the sugar maple in the foreground will grow very slowly, or probably half as fast as they would if they were thin. And they may only make it to 16, 18 inches in diameter and then be cut. And they may even be a little bit crooked because of different trees bumping into them or sway. Birches particularly would bend into them. Whereas if you clean that out and let these nice straight stems go, you'd get vigorous trees with really high quality wood, no knots and no other problems. I'll give you an example. In Germany, they take red oak, and the red oak that exists there has been planted through different silvicultural systems, and they actually plant beech trees next to them. Now, why is that? Beech trees are very shade tolerant. So a red oak can be 100 feet tall, and the beech trees next to it will be 60 feet tall, and they're shade tolerant. They'll grow very well. And what do the beech trees do? They shade the trunk of the red oak tree. And the reason you want to shade the trunk of the red oak tree is to prevent adventitious budding. So adventitious budding is when you see if you can do this in your own backyard. you'll see a new branch coming out of the trunk. There's buds hidden in the phloem and xylem underneath the bark, and they'll come out laterally. And if that happens, it damages the wood, because all of a sudden you have knots in the wood from the branches. But if you shade them, the wood is perfectly clear. And as a result, in Germany, what they do is they auction the logs. I spent some time over there, and you could take the logs out of the woods, and they line them up on a roadside on 2 stretchers essentially, and they roll them over, and people come in and bid on each log. So Porsche, for example, will come in and say, well, we need some red oak for our car dashboards or whatever. I'll give you $10,000 for that log. Enormous prices. Whereas normally, that log here in the United States might be worth $500. I'm talking about 1,000 board feet, I should explain that. So here it might be $500 per 1,000 board feet, and over there it might be $5,000 per 1,000 board feet. Also, peeler logs are like that. So a peeler log is you put it on a lathe, and you peel it off, and it's perfectly clear all the way. Those logs will be very valuable. So you want to make high quality logs. The key is making those high quality logs so you can get more money for them. And then the economic question comes in, does that really work in terms of how much money I've got to spend to do the intermediate thinning? And the time frame, now the time horizon for growing forests is very long. So a lot of people would never do that because they're not going to see the results of that income. Their kids might, or their grandchildren might, but they will not. So here's another example of thinning. This is in white pine, mixed white pine forest. So it's white pine and hardwoods. You can see the pine over on this side more. And this is the objective, is to see how they're thinned out, they're spaced out, and the crowns are much higher and bigger and more full. And that's what you want to achieve, these big crowns. Especially if it's like a sugar bush. We're all familiar with sugar bushes, right? So you go to a sugar bush and you want sugar maple trees that are big and have enormous crowns, because you want to increase the sugar concentration in your sap as much as possible. Why do you want that? Because typically a sugar maple is going to have about 2.5%, not that much, maybe 2% sugar concentration in its sap. And by putting a spout into a sugar tree, the sap comes out, it goes to the collector and evaporation, and then the cost of evaporation is enormous, because you got to get rid of all that water. You just want to keep the sugar. You got to get rid of the water. So it's called the Jones Rule of 86. So it takes 86 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup at 1% sugar concentration. So that's the Jones Rule of 86. So if your sugar concentration in your sugar tree is 2%, it only takes 43 gallons. And if it's 3%, it takes like 12 gallons. And it really makes a difference. So you can triple your yields by increasing your sugar concentration. Now, why is one sugar tree more sweet than another? I don't know. The science doesn't seem to really know either. But it's really important that you want to go out and test your trees, and if you find a tree that's got, I've seen 3.5%, 4% sugar concentrations, you want those trees. Absolutely, you want to try to hybridize them or clone them as well. So anyway, the point being here is that you want to grow these big crowns. You want to have the nice straight stems, really high quality trees. Remember, these were done in the 30s, so we're not going to see any trucks typically, but just still horses. And this is another conversion. This is something we don't do anymore at all. They did it in the 30s. I was talking to John earlier. They're talking about planting red pine, and the government used to pay you to plant red pine. And there's red pine all over the state in different pockets. But that's what that's what this crew is doing. And they're planting, well, in this case, they're planting white pine. But the red pine, everybody thought, well, they'd be great because they'll grow really fast, and they do. But the lumber usage for them is not very good, because it's what's called a hard pine. Like the southern pines are typically hard pines. Longleaf pine, loblolly pine, shortleaf pine, pitch pine, they're all what's called a hard pine. And you want the softer pines like white pine, white bark pine, western white pine, well, all very different in texture. The hard pines, like red pine, the value is not there as much. They're used for cabin logs now, some pulpwood, but not nearly the demand as we have with white pine. So there's not much planting going on, certainly not in the east. There's a lot of planting in the west, but very little in the east. If you want to, in here, in the 30s, the big push was for white pine. They thought because hardwoods didn't have as much value. Now, hardwoods are much more valuable. To give you an idea, a white pine tree on the stump, meaning standing in the forest, might be worth $100 to $150 per 1,000 board feet. Sugar maple might be worth $500 per 1,000 board feet. So it's significantly different. However, the white pine might have 1,000 board feet in the tree, and the sugar maple might only have like 200 board feet in the tree. So it kind of evens out, and it's the growth rates and everything else. So you have to take all these things into consideration when you're doing the management. And here, all they're doing is attempting to thin out an area so that they can grow more white pine. This is a white pine release. So what happens typically is that this is gray birch on top. So if you look at Danby Mountain, the whole top of Danby Mountain just about is heartleaf birch and gray birch. You guys are probably mountain bike riders, and I don't know if you've been up those trails, but it's all gray birch up there. And there's some white pine and some spruce and fir, but not very much, because everything is overtopping. The gray birch doesn't get very big. It's high elevation. It's almost 4,000 feet, and it's rocky soil, so it's not going to grow very much. But here, in this case, they're thinning it out. They're taking the gray birch out so that to release. It's called a release cutting. You want to release those trees so they can grow. If those trees are already about 30, 35, 40 years old, they will not release. It's like saying, well, I'm 6'2", and you're 5'10", and we're both 70 years old. If you cut me down, you're not going to grow any bigger. That's just the way it is. It's a genetic makeup. So, and that's very true for trees as well. So this is something that we should do, though, and this makes a huge difference. They're pruning. And this is you can see a guy up on a ladder. This is a guy down low pruning with an axe. And these guys are up on ladders pruning. You want to increase the yield, increase the quality of your wood, you take all the branches off. If you possibly can, reach up as high as you can. And that's all this is. Okay, so this is the key part of silviculture. There's 4 parts to silviculture, 4 different ways to manage trees. Seed tree, or selection cut. A selection cut means you go in, forest, you take out this tree, that tree, maybe one over here, one over there. Typically you take out high quality trees, and if you're a good forester, a good logger, you take out the low quality stuff, the junk, to get rid of it. So you're thinning at the same time you're harvesting. And that is really crucial. So if anybody's working on your property, you want them taking out the poor quality trees at the same time they're taking out the good quality trees. So that's a selection harvest. We're going to talk about group selection in a minute. The second type of cutting is shelter wood cutting. Shelter wood, and we'll talk about that, I've got a couple slides on that, is successional stage cutting inside a forest to grow a different size habitat, or different size trees. So you're cutting from below. You're taking out the poor quality stuff. And then the next cut, you may take out some dominant trees, maybe a few co-dominants, but the rest are going to be intermediate trees. And then the third cut, you take the rest. So if you start with 150, let's say you start with a basal area. There's a term for you. Basal area. Basal area is the square foot surface area of a stump. Okay? So if you cut down a tree, and all that's left is that flat stump, that basal area is what we use continually as calculations. So in a good forest, we might have, let's say, 150, 170 square feet of basal area per acre. So it doesn't sound like much. So you got 150 like this, right? But this is all quality stuff. And you may want to reduce that to 100. So if you start out in a thinning operation, of shelter wood, let's say you start out with a basal area of 180. In the first cut, you may want to take out 40 square feet of basal area from below. The next cut, you may want to take out another 40 square feet of basal area of dominant, co-dominant, and intermediate tree sizes. And in the third cut, then you take off the rest, and meanwhile, the rest of those trees are going to be coming up. And so you start a new stand, and you continue that and continue that. I know it's a little complicated. We'll talk about it in a second. The third one is seed tree, easy one. You take a bunch of white pine in an area, let's say you got an acre, you cut everything down, you leave 5 white pine trees. And you just leave the seed. And of course, the last one is clear cutting. And clear cutting is actually very good in a lot of species, for a lot of species, because it creates new opportunities for diversity. But the consensus is in the United States that clear cutting is terrible. And that's just, we have to deal with that. And it's a problem because clear cutting really works. I can show you places in the National Forest where they clear cut, and it's just typical. It's just terrific. Excuse me. So let's go back to group selection. So this is a group selection. So how does that work? I think that, my personal feeling, I think this is the best silvicultural technique. What we're doing here is taking out a whole group of trees, maybe 1 to 3 acres. It's not a clear cut. Clear cuts are like 40 acres, maybe 10 acres. But groups of three or four acres to create new diversity and new opportunities for trees to come in. And let's say you have 100 acres of land. And you go into that area and you create maybe 4 or 5 different 3 to 5 acre groups. And that'd be group selection. You cut down those trees, and all those other trees would seed in. And you can do that continually, let's say you're doing that every 20 years. So by the time you come back to the first one, those trees will be 80 to 100 years old. And it works really well. It's great for wildlife, it's great for diversity, it makes great wood. A real problem in Vermont with selection harvesting and others is beech regeneration. We can't sell beech. Beech is very little value. It's great for bears. They love it. Obviously, we're doing really good with bears. But the beech quality is fine, but it's very susceptible to beech nectria and other diseases here. If you look at a beech tree, you'll see little scars all over it. That's typically nectria. and the problem is that it's got almost no value. It'll be used for good firewood, but that's about it. To get a logger to come take it, very difficult. So by making these types of cuts, it works very well. The second really important part is that it's hard to get people to work in the woods anymore. As a result, forestry has become very mechanized. And you see all the loggers around here, if you know the loggers around here, Bruce Wade and others, they all have feller bunchers. Now what's a feller buncher? A feller buncher walks up to a tree, it's this giant machine, about the size of this building, well not quite big. It grabs onto the tree, and just picks up the whole tree, and lays it on the ground. And by doing it, it's a very quick, efficient way. There's no chainsaws in the woods. The guy doesn't have to get off the machine and doesn't get hurt. Logging is the third most dangerous activity known to man, according to the insurance companies of America. Number 1 is war and the army. Number 2 is motorcycle racing. And number 3 is logging. There's more injuries per 100 than anything else. And they're right, it's very, very dangerous. But by mechanizing it, it makes it much safer, and you get people to work in the woods because they're all just running joysticks. So if you're in a big feller buncher, everything is on a joystick. And they don't have to get off the skidders. The skidders all have clamshells in the back, so there's no more cables. You used to have to pull a cable out, walk through all the brush, put a chain around the tree, attach the cable, and then haul it out. Now the skidder just backs up to the whole pile, goes, clams onto it, and off they go. And it works out great. And they get to the landing, and next time, I don't have time. They pick up the whole tree, and they go, the machine does this. The whole tree is shaped right off, all the branches, one shot. And then it goes onto another set of tracks, and it's cut into different log lengths, and then taken off and put on the trucks, and away it goes. So the logs are never touched by humans. But that's what happens when you can't get the help or the manpower, and it's a brutal job. Logging, as we saw the first guy, keep going back to that first slide, the guy's trying to clear his fields, and it's just incredible. We don't do that anymore.
The feller bunchers actually go on hills?
Oh yeah, they go on very steep slopes. They're on tracks typically. Some are on tires, but some are tracks. So in this kind of area, so again, we're back into the group selection, the feller buncher takes a lot of space. Now, if you drive up Bromley Mountain, on the right-hand side, you'll see an area that was, it's actually, I think it was a selection company. To me, it looks like a shelter wood. And they did that with feller bunchers. So they could drive around between the trees, and that was done maybe 15 years ago. And it turned out terrific. Even the Forest Service was surprised how well it worked. And it's beautiful, big trees, great regeneration, really well done. Also on the left side, as you go up Browning Mountain, just before the Long Trail parking lot, there was a job just done, up higher, it's harder to see. Again, filler bunchers, and they worked out really well, and did a great job. So group selection, I believe, is really the way to go in the future, or it is now anyway. This is the shelterwood. This, as I said, there's 3 different stages to the shelterwood. So what you're doing is you're gradually taking out the understory and parts of the overstory, not the whole thing. You're creating space for the dominant trees, the really high quality hardwoods. And so that's what's going on here. And this is how they make the dioramas. I'm doing a quick transition, I apologize for that. But you can see over on this side is the base, and then they started putting the stuff in, and then they added more and more and more. And this is all done with copper wire. And they twist copper wire together to make the tree trunks. And then the leaves are from copper wire that's pressed down and spread out. Wow, I mean, I was amazed. It's truly a work of art to see this thing. And that's Mr. Fisher of the Fisher Museum with a pretty good haul. Dinner time. Thank you very much. This has been very nice.
So we'll open up for questions now, but I'm going to start. I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to put all of you on the spot. You were talking about Biltmore and the forestry school down there in western North Carolina. And Otto Schenk, was that his name?
Yeah.
So I know what we're all thinking. What does Otto Schenk have to do with Dorset history?
Right.
Nothing. The real question is, what does Otto Schenk have to do with the history of Rupert?
Oh.
He was a cousin of George Merck, and he helped
Really?
George Merck set up Merck Forest.
I never knew that.
Yeah, so
That is
there you have it.
fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a good piece.
So hopefully that warmed you up for any other questions.
David.
We about 10 years ago took out about a dozen really big pine trees. Didn't get anything for them because we didn't want them to tear up the lawn, but anyway, they're gone, except the stumps are there. And the acres is full of weed trees, those thorny locust things. It's the grossest forest you ever saw. So, I don't know, I guess you need to get a machine in there and get it all out and let the popple trees come up.
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do. If you want to have rough crops habitat, yes.
Yeah.
But you have to have popple trees already there. Were there aspen trees there?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, then I would absolutely do that. I've used machines. I think it's called a brontosaurus.
Yeah.
And I know, but they go through. It's like a giant lawnmower, and they go right through, and they chop up everything. Now you'll still get stuff coming back, but if the aspen trees are released fast enough, they'll shoot overtop most of the other vegetation. So, what kind? Do you have the thorn trees? Are they trees or are they bushes or?
Well, now they're only about this high. They just came up last year.
Oh, okay.
But I mean,
They're
you
invasive species.
can't get near them with your electric chainsaw.
Yeah.
It's
No,
thorn.
they're invasive. No, they're a problem. I was thinking you might burn it, but that's too dangerous. But the brontosaurus might work. Or you ever have like a grass cutter when you put a steel blade on it?
Mhm.
I use a steel blade on mine a lot, and that would go right through that stuff. You'd knock it all down. But wear a face mask because you get the thorns coming.
Thorns in the face.
We added to our woodlot by, we bought some land that was just subject to a money cut. And we got our hands on it, and gave it a 12-year head start, and it's completely overrun with stripers. You know,
With which?
with striped maples, moose
Oh, yeah, that's right,
maples.
okay, yeah.
And it's a horrible forest, and it's hand-to-hand combat at this point. Where does striped maples belong in this ecosystem?
Striped maple is also called moosewood, and striped maple is it comes in early on because it's a prolific cedar. It likes full sunlight. So it must have had a lot of full sunlight in there to bring it in. And it'll get overtopped, but it'll take time. You know, maybe 10 years more, 5 years more. Or you can go cut it. But that's a big chore. That's part of the problem of, your woodlot was originally a selective harvest or something?
Well, it was a properly tended woodlot, but then the prior owner just did a money cut. He took the logs and.
So you took all the good stuff, left all the junk. Yeah. That's called high grading, and that's a very common problem. Yeah, that's unfortunate. I wish I had a better solution for you, but
What elevation in this part of, in these forests does moose maple really belong?
oh, I've seen it up pretty high. I've up on the mountain past Bromley. I know there's big stands of it. It's preferred wildlife food, so the deer will eat it, which is a good thing. And as I said, moose love it. I've had moose follow me around up in Bromley, young moose, and they like this. They like the stuff, but it's you want to grow hardwoods, and you have to be very careful in opening the stand. That's why a lot of times if you open the stand enough, you get either the stump sprouts from where you were before. And I was thinking you could maybe do that, but I have to see it. But so the stump sprouts can grow very rapidly, and they'll outcompete the moosewood, which works very well. Or if the stand is really open, you get a lot of different vegetation that's all going to outcompete. But striped maple's a problem.
Can you confirm that girls really like teenage boys who cut down striped maples? That's a known fact, right?
I think I saw a study on that. Must be true. I think you got a crew here, right? Good to work, guys.
They're getting an hour off from the chore.
And Mom works on it too, so. I have my own clippers.
I missed it early on, but I don't know if you talked about it. When all the quarries were going on, you see pictures and there's no trees up on the mountains at all. And what was that all about? Was that something that was natural, or did they clear cut it for the?
They clear cut.
They clear cut.
So it's all the farms. There used to be farms. We had some slides on that early on, John. And all the farms were all the way up to the top of the mountains. And 85% of Vermont was open land. 85, right in that neighborhood was open. Sheep pasture primarily up high, cropland down low. We've never had really good cropland here. We grow some hay, but that's about it. But all the farmers left after the Civil War, and not after, but the whole period of decline from say 1860 to 1930. And all that land then reverted back to mixed forest, hardwoods and softwoods. I'll show you some slides later. Yes, sir.
Is there any part of the state that's never been logged?
Yes. Yes. I'm glad you brought that up. So Vermont is actually doing a big push right now to try to protect old growth forest. And my favorite place for old growth forest is on Fire Road 10. We talked about this earlier. As you go up from the road from Mount Tabor to Weston is a Forest Service road. It's kind of twisty and turny. It starts out as pavement all the way up to Little Rock Pond, and then it turns to gravel the rest of the way. But going up to Little Rock Pond, if you look on the right-hand side, it drops all the way down to Big Branch. I don't think that's ever been cut. And they're huge trees. I mean, they are monsters, and they're beautiful. And so that's one place. Another place is Equinox Mountain. So if you go up high, up by the slides, where the slides are, you can see the slides. A lot of that has never been cut. And even places, there's sections down low. So if you go on the Red Gate Trail and the other trails, the blue trail, the green trail, it'll take you by some of these places, and all of a sudden you'll see these giant trees. Well, there's two reasons for that. One is that there's been very little harvesting there, and two, the soils are so good. And the soils are good because of the marble. It's very calcium rich, and these trees grow like crazy there. And some of the best trees in the state are on the side of that mountain. They're gorgeous. The third place you could look is the 17th tee at the Dorset Field Club, which is up really high, and there's giant hemlocks all along the tree, all along the tee, and then it drops down to a steep gully. And that looks like old growth to me. So those are just three quick places that you can get to relatively easily. to take a look. But the state is making a big push, so as part of the current use plans now for your management programs, they want to protect these indigenous old-growth forests, and they're trying to do that. But they're hard to find. But there are a lot of areas, but they're typically on very steep slopes by rivers. Yes, ma'am.
My understanding of first growth or old growth was that it had very narrow lines in it when you see when you have a piece of the wood. And,
Growth rings.
growth,
The growth rings?
yeah, I guess so, or the rings, but I mean, if you've got a piece of wood, but I thought that had to do with the trees being very narrow because they were very close together.
Yes. So so what happens is, as a tree grows, each year it lays down, there's a new growth ring, right?
Yeah.
And typically we all know that you age a tree by counting the growth rings, whatever. So sometimes growth rings can be a quarter to a half inch apart if they're growing very vigorously, some pines, for example, even aspen. Other times they're very tight. So you look at the state tree, for example, might be 400 years old, but it's only 18 inches wide. Other trees might be 100 years old and they're 2 feet wide. So it really varies on the habitat. So it's soils and sunlight, crown closure, are the really two contributing factors.
Thanks, Rick.
Does the size of rings affect like the wood quality for harvesting, like, when you use them for like, building?
Yes. So it depends on the species. I'll back it up. No, it shouldn't. But there's certain trees, hemlock is a classic example, gets what's called ring shake. So hemlock, we saw these giant old hemlocks in here. Reason you see giant hemlocks? No one wanted them. You cut them down, you saw them in the lumber, and you try to put nails into them, and the nails pop out. Because the boards tend to warp and twist. And there's case after case of farmers putting these boards into their horse stalls. And, 5 years later, the nails are all coming out because the boards are twisting and turning.
Like Home Depot.
And the other issue is what's called ring shake. And what happens is a hemlock, when it grows, the wind is pushing on or whatever, and it tends to fracture those rings. They tend to break. And so you cut the tree down, you try to saw it up, and the thing just falls apart because it's already broken all the way through it. So you try to take a board off, and the board just goes, it's not a board, it's just pieces. So that's a problem. But if you're doing, let's say oak. So oak trees, red oak and white oak. You can use white oak for ships and cooperage because it gets the bacteria, and it's called, they're tyloses, and they plug the pores in the growth ring so they don't leak. Red oak doesn't have that, and they'll leak. So that's why the British Navy is English white oak or whatever it was, and then the American mass that we talked about. So it all changes. But normally, the other one is ash. So the True Temper here in Wallingford takes a lot of ash from southern Vermont, and they make it into axe handles or hockey sticks or whatever. And I played a lot of hockey, and we would look for hockey sticks that had certain types of growth rings in the butt of the stick, so it was fairly straight, and we thought we could get better flexing with that. So yeah, in that case it matters. But for most, in hammers, supposedly that matters too, or mauls. But normally for sugar maple, no. It shouldn't.
Where do you find aspen trees in Vermont? Never seen one.
Well, I think they're everywhere, yeah. We go out and probably see one. There's a lot. It's, Populus tremuloides is called quaking aspen. And they're everywhere. So and then there's cottonwood as part of the aspen family too. along stream sides and all that kind of stuff. So there's really, balsam poplar is also in the same family. So there's a lot of different, but they're pretty prevalent. Okay.
So, thank you. Just a few quick housekeeping announcements. First of all, we've got refreshments out there. Please partake. Cookies and some sparkling flavored drinks. Next month, for our third Thursday lunchtime lecture, will be Dave Pitlick from the Battle of Bennington Historic Site. He'll be talking about myths of the Battle of Bennington. For instance, who here can tell me where the Battle of Bennington was not? Very good. So, to find out more myths, come on.
Last week was the
Right, was a big,
centennial of, no.
not quite yet.
Yeah.
We are working on the 250th celebration of the Battle of Bennington, which will be in 2027.
There you go.
Yeah. And of course, the 250th anniversary of the First Dorset Convention is in just 2 years, so there'll be big celebrations for that too. All right, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How do I get my critter out?
Pull it up.
Oh, I thought you had the ejecto.
No,
Maples all the
You
time.
don't?
it never yells at me if I just pull it out. So.
After you.
Great, thank you.
Good job.
Good to see you.
Really good.